For 4 generations, nobody in my family ever went past the boulder at the top of our land. The strange part is, none of us could remember who taught us that rule. My brothers and I had that conversation on a Saturday evening in late October, on the screened porch at the back of our parents' house. The temperature was dropping fast after sunset, the kind of cold you can smell coming. We had drinks in our hands and nothing pressing to discuss, and somewhere in the middle of that easy wandering conversation, my brother Caleb brought up the upper trail. He did not make a dramatic thing of it. He said almost to himself that he had been thinking about the property lately, specifically about the way all three of us had grown up treating the boulder at the top of the trail as the natural endpoint, the place you went to and then came back from. And he said he had been trying, honestly trying, to remember who had first told us that, who had sat us down and drawn the line, who had said in whatever words that the boulder was as far as we went, and that what lay beyond it was not ours. None of us could remember. My other brother Tom thought about it for a long time before he spoke, which is always his way. He turns a question over carefully before he commits to an answer. And what he finally said was that he thought some things get absorbed by a person before that person has the language or the memory structure to hold them as a story. He said some knowledge enters through the texture of childhood itself, through the way adults move in certain spaces, and the things they choose not to do as much as the things they do. You pick it up the way you pick up an accent, without ever being formally taught, until it becomes part of how you understand the world. Maddie, our sister, said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Or you forget you were ever told, because you were too small to hold the words, but you held the rule." I think she was right. I think that is exactly what it was. I want to tell you about the property, because the land is part of this in a way that cannot be separated from the rest. The property came to our family through our great-grandfather, who bought it in 1906. Around 240 acres in a part of the state that still carries the old heavy feel of original country. The kind of place where the landscape gives the impression of having been doing what it does for a very long time before people got involved, and of being perfectly prepared to go back to that once people are finished. The lower portion of the land is pasture and creek bottom, with a wide, slow-moving stretch of water along the eastern edge that our grandfather used to fish in the mornings before anyone else was awake. The old smokehouse still leans into the dirt at the edge of the pasture, its door hanging open, its tin roof going to rust. Above the pastures, the land rises steadily into a wooded hillside, and the tree cover there is thick and old, the kind of growth that does not let much light through, even in midsummer. The kind that has a sound of its own, that you can only really hear when you stop moving and let it settle around you. There is a trail through those trees that was cut by hand at some point in the family's history, worn smooth enough by generations of use that it reads as permanent. The trail climbs for roughly a quarter-mile through oak and maple and hemlock before it levels off near the top of the hill. And in the bend of that trail, where it turns sharply to the left, sits the boulder. A great gray slab of granite, waist-high, the flat top of it worn smooth from years of people resting there, wide enough for 2 people to sit on with room to spare. You can see it from a long way down the trail when the leaves are off the trees in autumn, that gray-white shape against the sky, and as a child it always felt like a destination, the obvious place to aim for when you climbed the hill. And then behind it the land continued. The ground dropped slightly and rose again into a steeper slope covered with dense hemlock growth, the branches close and low, the light under them dim even at midday. That was the part none of us ever entered. Not because of any formal rule, not because anyone had fenced it off or posted it or marked it in any visible way. We simply did not go there. We reached the boulder and we turned around. I climbed that trail probably 100 times between the ages of 8 and 18. I went up with Caleb and Tom, with cousins who visited in the summers, with friends from school. Every single time we stopped at the boulder, we sat on it, sometimes for only a few minutes and sometimes for the better part of an afternoon if the weather was good. We looked back down at the pastures, at the creek catching the light in the distance, and then we came back down. Not once did anyone suggest going further. Not once did anyone even seem to consider it. It was not a topic. It was simply the shape of things. There was one story, only one, and I heard it only once. I was 9 years old. A cousin was visiting and asked an innocent question about a photograph in the hallway. A young man in a wool coat with a deer rifle held loose across his chest. My father told the story flat and quick. The young man was a great-uncle of ours named Theodore. He had gone up the trail in the fall of 1958 to track a deer he had wounded. He had not come back that night. He had not come back the next day either. The sheriff brought dogs up from the county seat, and they walked the lower pasture and the trail. and they reached the boulder, and the dogs would not go past it. They lay down in the dirt at the foot of the boulder, and they whined, and they would not be coaxed forward, not by treats, not by commands, not by their handlers pulling at their collars. The search was called off after 3 days. Theodore was never found. There was no body, there was no clothing, there was nothing. My father told it without embellishment and without warning us about anything afterward. He simply finished and went back to his coffee. But I remember that my mother got up from the table and walked out of the room while he was speaking. And I remember that my father did not look at any of us when he was finished. He looked at the wall. That is what I knew, growing up. That is the entire weight of what I knew. And it should have been enough. It would have been enough for anyone who had not gone up there. The morning I went past the boulder was a Saturday in early October. I was 23 years old. I had come home for a long weekend from the city where I was working, and I was the kind of young man who believed at 23 that he had outgrown most of what his family had told him about anything, including the land, including the rules that had been handed down without ever being spoken. My father had left at dawn to drive into town. My mother was at the country church she had attended every Sunday of her adult life. I had the house to myself, and I had my grandfather's old rifle in the gun cabinet, and I had a clear blue morning with no wind in it. I told myself I was just going to walk the trail a little further than usual. I did not tell myself I was going past the boulder. I would not have admitted that, even to myself, while I was still in the kitchen lacing my boots. I want to be precise about my state of mind, because I have thought about it many times since. I was not anxious. I was not acting on any unusual impulse. I was a man in his early 20s on a clear fall morning on land he had known his entire life. There was nothing in me that morning that understood this walk would be different. I left the house at about 7 o'clock. The grass in the lower pasture was stiff with frost. The creek was running low. I crossed the footbridge and started up the trail through the tree line, and the air got colder the higher I went. The trees got taller and closer together. The canopy overhead was dense enough that the light dropped noticeably as I climbed, turning from the gold of the early morning to something flatter and more enclosed. The sounds from below, the birds, the water from the creek, went quiet as I moved deeper into the trees. My footsteps on the packed dirt became the main sound. That and my own breathing. After about 40 minutes, the path bent sharply to the left, and the boulder came into view between the trees, that quiet gray bulk waiting where it had always waited. I stopped at the boulder for a long time. I do not remember thinking anything in particular. I remember laying my hand against the granite and feeling how cold it was. I remember looking past it up the slope where the path continued faint and narrow into ground that no one in my family had walked in over 60 years. There was nothing to see, just trees, just the dim brown carpet of pine needles, just the slope going up. I went past the boulder. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. The path was overgrown, but it was still a path. Someone had used it at some point in the last decade or two. I could see places where a branch had been broken back at chest height, and the breaks were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. The grade got steeper. I had to take the rifle off my shoulder and use my free hand to brace against tree trunks. My breath was loud in my own ears. The first thing that was wrong was a smell. It came at me on a thin downdraft of air, and it was the smell of something burning, very faint. Wood smoke mixed with something else that I did not want to put a name to. I stopped on the path and I listened, and I heard nothing, and I told myself the smell was probably drifting up from a hunter's camp on the next ridge over. I kept walking. The second thing that was wrong was a tree. I came up to a flat shelf in the slope, a small natural terrace where the ground leveled off for perhaps 30 feet before climbing again. And on the far edge of that terrace there was a large oak with something hanging from one of its lower branches. It was a deer, or what had been a deer. It had been gutted and skinned and tied up by its hind legs with a length of yellow nylon rope. The rope was new, the rope was bright and clean, and the cut on the deer's belly was still dark and wet at the edges. Someone had done this within the last 12 hours. I did not move. I stood at the edge of the terrace with the rifle in my hands, and I tried to think clearly. The smell of smoke was stronger here. I could see now, past the oak, a thin gray thread of smoke lifting from somewhere further up the slope, threading up between the branches in a way that was almost gentle. I should have turned around. I knew I should have turned around. But there was a thing in me that wanted to see, that needed to see, what was up there. I told myself I would go just a little further. I told myself I would be quiet. I cut sideways off the path, moving slowly, putting my boots down between roots and dry leaves, breathing through my mouth so my breath would not whistle. I went maybe 100 yards. I came around the trunk of a fallen pine, and I saw it. There was a clearing, not a large one, maybe 40 feet across. There was a low cabin in it, built of unpeeled logs, with a tin chimney pipe leaning out of the roof, and the smoke was coming from the pipe in a slow gray line. There was a small stack of firewood by the door. There was a tarp on the ground beside the cabin with things laid out on it that I did not want to look at long enough to identify. There was a wire fence running around part of the clearing, low and old. And there were things tied to the fence at intervals, small bundles wrapped in what looked like burlap, dark at the bottom where they hung against the wire. And there was a man. He was sitting on a wooden stump beside the cabin. He was not moving. He was facing the direction I had come from. He was looking at me. I could not tell how old he was. He was thin. His hair was long and gray and matted into his beard. He was wearing dark clothes that did not look like clothes you could buy in any store I had ever been in. Layers of cloth and hide stitched together with what might have been sinew or twine. He had a long shape across his knees that was almost certainly a rifle. He did not stand up. He did not call out. He just looked at me. And here is the part I cannot stop thinking about, even now, 8 years later. He was not surprised. There was no flicker of alarm on his face, no moment of recalculation. He had known I was there before I had come around the fallen pine. He had probably known I was there from the moment I had laid my hand on the boulder. He had been sitting on that stump, waiting for me to finish closing the distance. And then, very slowly, without taking his eyes off me, he raised one hand. He pointed back down the slope. The way I had come. I turned. I started walking. Then I started running. Before I tell you what my father confessed to me in that hospital room 3 months later, and before I tell you about the others who went past the boulder and never came back, I want to ask you something. If this story has pulled you in this far, take 1 second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells YouTube that stories like this one deserve to find the people who need to hear them. The dark is full of them. I'll keep telling them as long as you keep listening. Now, back to the mountain. I do not remember most of the rundown. I remember the sound of my own boots and the sound of my own breathing. I remember stumbling once badly on a root and going down on one knee and tearing my pants and not feeling it. I remember the boulder coming up out of the trees in front of me like a thing rising to meet me, and I remember slapping my hand against it as I went past as if I were tagging a base in a children's game. I did not stop running until I was back at the house. I came in through the kitchen door and I locked it behind me. I put the rifle on the table. I sat down in a chair. My hands were shaking so badly that I could not pour myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the counter. I sat there for over an hour before I trusted my legs to carry me into the living room. I did not tell anyone what I had done that day. I did not tell my father when he came home from town. I did not tell my mother when she got back from church. For 2 days I walked around the house quiet, and I ate my meals, and I answered when I was spoken to, and I told no one. I was not embarrassed exactly. I was not ashamed. It was that I did not know how to find the words for what I had seen, and I did not know what it would mean if I tried to say them out loud. On Monday morning I drove back to the city. That summer my father had a small stroke, a minor one. He was kept in the hospital for 3 nights for observation. While he was there, I sat with him alone in his room one evening, and I told him all of it. The deer hanging from the oak, the smoke, the clearing, the cabin, the man on the stump, and the long shape across his knees and the hand pointing back down the mountain. My father listened to me without interrupting. He listened to me the way he had listened to me when I was a small boy and I would come to him with some long and complicated grievance. When I had finished talking, he closed his eyes for a moment, and he sat very still in the hospital bed. Then he told me what he had not told me before. There had not been only Theodore. Before Theodore, in 1929, there had been a hired hand my great-grandfather had taken on for the spring. The hired hand had walked up past the boulder one afternoon to look for a stray calf, and he had not come back. My great-grandfather had gone up himself, just once, just to the boulder, and he had stood there, and he had called the hired hand's name into the trees for an hour, and there had been no answer. After that he had walked back down to the house, and he had nailed a wooden board across the path above the boulder. The board had stood there for 40 years. In 1971, a neighbor's boy, 14 years old, had crossed onto our land while hunting with a friend, and the two of them had gone up the path together. The friend had turned back at the boulder, scared by something he could not name, and he had waited at the foot of it for 2 hours, and the boy had never come back. The county had searched for a week. They had found one of his boots at the edge of the upper timber. They had found nothing else. My father said, very quietly, that he himself had gone up past the boulder once. In the fall of 1974, he had been 21 years old. He had not seen a cabin. He had seen, he said, a thin trail of footprints in fresh snow leading away from the path and into the trees, and a place where someone had been dragging something heavy through the brush. He had turned around, he had gone home, and he had not spoken of it for over 30 years, not until that evening with me in the hospital room. He said the man had been up there as long as our family had owned the land. He said the man had been up there before our family had owned the land. He said that whether it was the same man all these years, or whether it was a son, or a grandson, or some line of them living up there one after another, he did not know, and he had never wanted to know. He said the only rule was the rule. You do not go past the boulder. You let the man have what is his, and he lets you have what is yours. And the line between the two is the line of cold gray granite at the bend in the path. So long as you keep to your side of it, the arrangement holds. I have thought about that for 8 years, and I have come to believe something my father did not say out loud, but that I think he understood as well as I do. The rule did not start with us. It was not invented by my great-grandfather when he bought the land in 1906. The man who sold him the property warned him about it at the time of the sale. The deed runs to the boulder. The deed runs no further. Whatever is on the other side of the boulder is not yours to walk on, and you would do well not to. Whoever wrote the deed in the 1800s knew the line. Whoever sold the land to whoever wrote the deed knew the line. Somewhere back in a part of the country's history that is not in any book, somebody walked up that slope, and somebody learned what was up there, and somebody came back down and made a rule about it. And then they made sure that rule got passed on. Not as a story. Stories get embellished and forgotten. Not as a warning. Warnings get dismissed by 23-year-olds with their grandfather's rifle and a clear blue morning. They passed it on as instinct, as the texture of how a family moves on a piece of land, as the casual certainty of adults who do not need to make a performance of what they know, because the knowing is old enough and deep enough to require no drama. That is what Tom was trying to say on the porch that night. That is what Maddie meant when she said you forget you were ever told. The boundary was not invented. It was earned, probably more than once. And the people who earned it spent their remaining years making sure that knowledge was passed on in the deepest possible way, below the level of memory, into the level of instinct. Our family had been keeping its distance from that slope for 4 generations. It held for every single one of us, until it didn't hold for me. I think about him most at night. I think about the man on the stump. I think about how he did not stand up. I think about how he did not raise his rifle and shoot me, though he could have, easily, and no one would ever have found me. The body of a young man who had wandered off the path on his family's own land would have lain up there for 100 years, and the rain and the cold and the animals would have done the rest, and no sheriff would ever have come knocking on the door of the cabin in the clearing. He could have, he did not. I think about the slow way he raised his hand and pointed me back down the slope. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was something quieter than either of those things. He was a man who had been told, perhaps once, and perhaps many times, that the land below the boulder belonged to the people in the white farmhouse at the bottom of the slope, and that he was to leave them alone so long as they left him alone. And that morning I had walked into his half of the arrangement, and he was, in his way, walking me back out of it. He let me go. He let me go because the rule cuts both ways. My father is gone now. He died 2 winters ago. The land has passed to my brother Caleb, who lives there with his wife and his 2 small children. Caleb keeps the lower pasture mowed and the smokehouse standing, and he walks the trail through the tree line once a month with a rifle on his shoulder. But he turns around at the boulder, every time, without fail. He does not look past it for longer than the second or 2 it takes to put his hand on the granite, turn his body around, and start back down. His children have never been told the story. They are too young, and I have come to believe the way my father believed, that they should not be told as a story at all. They will learn it the way I should have learned it. The way I almost learned it, before I ruined the lesson by needing to see for myself, through the texture of how their father moves on that land, through what he does without explaining, through the shape of 100 ordinary moments on that property that will add up gradually to a felt understanding that the boulder is the end of what belongs to us. They will carry it the way I carried it, before I tested it, as a reflex, as something below conscious thought, as knowledge that does not need to identify itself in order to function. And I hope it holds for them the way it should have held for me. The mountain does not belong to our family. Our family belongs to the mountain. We exist on it under terms the mountain sets. and there are portions of it that were never ours to enter or to understand. The lower pastures, the creek, the tree line, the trail as far as the boulder, all of that has been granted to us. Beyond the boulder is something else, and that something else has proven its patience and its presence over 120 years of an arrangement we did not write and cannot rewrite. I will not be going back to the property this year. I do not think I will be going back next year either. When I do go back, eventually, I will not walk into the tree line at all. I will sit on the porch and I will drink coffee with my brother, and I will watch the lower pasture in the long evening light. I will not look up the slope toward the place where the path bends, and I will not think about what is sitting on a stump somewhere up there in the trees, breathing the same cold air I am breathing, waiting. If that story reached you, take one moment before the next one begins. Tap the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. It costs you nothing, and it tells YouTube to bring stories like this one to other people who lie awake at night the way you do. The dark is full of these stories, and I will keep finding them as long as you keep listening. October 15th, 2023. I was 24 years old, and this marked my 6th year joining my best friend Riley on our annual trip to visit his grandparents in the remote mountains of northern Georgia. The small town of Cedar Falls wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along winding mountain roads, but it held a special place in both our hearts. Riley's grandfather, whom we called Pops, was a 73-year-old retired park ranger who had spent his entire life in these mountains. His stories of the wilderness, the changing seasons, and the wildlife that called these peaks home had shaped both Riley and me into the outdoor enthusiasts we'd become. The cabin sat on 12 acres of heavily forested land, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets when the wind picked up. Every October, we'd make the 4-hour drive from Atlanta, leaving behind the chaos of city life for something more primitive, more real. This year felt different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the unseasonably warm weather, or perhaps the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer between the trees, but there was an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there in previous years. Pops had aged noticeably since our last visit. His hands, once steady enough to thread a fishing line in complete darkness, now trembled slightly as he poured his morning coffee, but his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning the tree line with the practiced awareness of someone who'd spent decades watching for danger in the wilderness. He'd been telling us stories all week about increased drug activity in the area, about hikers finding abandoned camps with suspicious equipment, about the kind of people who used the remote trails for purposes that had nothing to do with enjoying nature. "You boys need to be extra careful out there," he'd warned us repeatedly. "These mountains aren't as safe as they used to be. People are using the deeper trails for things that would make your skin crawl. I've reported 3 separate incidents to the sheriff's department this year alone. Camps with enough chemical residue to suggest serious manufacturing operations, and the kind of people who don't take kindly to unexpected visitors." Riley and I had laughed off his concerns initially, attributing them to the paranoia that sometimes comes with age and isolation. We were young, fit, and familiar with these mountains. What could possibly go wrong during a simple night hike? But as the week progressed, I found myself paying closer attention to Pop's warnings, noticing the way he checked and rechecked the locks on the cabin doors, the way he kept his old hunting rifle closer than usual, and the way he seemed to listen for sounds that weren't quite right. The decision to go on a night hike had been mine. I'd been feeling restless, cooped up in the cabin for days of unseasonably warm weather that made daytime hiking uncomfortable. The October nights had been perfect, cool enough to be comfortable, clear enough to see the stars, and quiet enough to hear the mountains breathe. Riley had been enthusiastic about the idea, and even Pops had agreed to join us, though he'd insisted on bringing equipment that seemed excessive for a simple walk in the woods. "Night hiking is different," he'd explained as he packed his old military-grade night vision binoculars. "Your senses get heightened, but your visibility gets compromised. You need to be prepared for anything." He'd also insisted we carry extra flashlights, a first aid kit, and his emergency whistle, the kind that could be heard for miles in the mountain stillness. As we prepared for our hike that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times throughout the day, I'd caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. When I'd looked directly, there was nothing there except the gentle sway of pine branches in the breeze. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me constantly want to look over my shoulder. The sun had set completely by the time we loaded into Pop's old Ford pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness as we made our way down the mountain road toward our chosen trail. The radio crackled with static-filled country music that seemed to fade in and out as we wound through the valleys. I sat in the passenger seat watching the darkness press in around us, while Riley occupied the space behind me, his excitement infectious despite my growing unease. "Remember the first time we did this?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the kind of nostalgia that comes with shared memories. "We were so scared of every little sound, jumping at shadows and convincing ourselves we were hearing things that weren't there." I remembered it well. We'd been 19 then, still young enough to believe that the woods held only the dangers we could see and understand. 5 years of these annual trips had taught us differently. The mountains held secrets, and some of those secrets were darker than others. Pops drove with the practiced ease of someone who knew these roads like the lines on his palm, but I noticed his knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He'd been unusually quiet during dinner, checking his watch frequently and glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. When I'd asked him about it, he'd simply said that the mountains had been talking differently lately, whatever that meant. The trail we'd chosen was one we'd hiked several times before, a well-maintained path that wound along a creek bed for about 2 miles before opening into a small clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. It was popular with day hikers and photographers, but rarely used after dark. The parking area was usually empty this time of night, which made the presence of the black Chevrolet SUV all the more unsettling. "Well, that's not right," Pops muttered as our headlights illuminated the vehicle. It was an older model, maybe early 2000s, with tinted windows and enough rust and dents to suggest it had seen better days. More concerning were the 2 figures sitting inside, their faces barely visible in the darkness, but their posture suggesting they were watching us with the same intensity we were watching them. The SUV was parked directly in front of the trail entrance, positioned in a way that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. One of the men, I could see now that they were both middle-aged, both wearing dark clothing, leaned forward as our headlights swept across their windshield. For a moment, we stared at each other across the darkness, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Drug dealers," Pop said matter-of-factly, putting the truck in reverse. "I've seen that vehicle before, usually around the times when the sheriff's department finds those illegal camps I told you about. We're not hiking this trail tonight." As we backed away from the parking area, I watched the SUV in the side mirror. Neither man moved, but I could feel their eyes following us as we retreated down the mountain road. The encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it left me with the distinct impression that we'd narrowly avoided something unpleasant. "There's another trail about half a mile down," Pops explained as we drove away from the first location. "It's not as scenic, but it's got good elevation and decent views. More importantly, it's got multiple entry and exit points, which means we won't be trapped if someone decides to follow us." The second trail was accessed by a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main mountain highway. It was the kind of road that would be easy to miss unless you knew it was there, winding through dense forest before opening into a small clearing where hikers typically parked. Pops drove slowly, his headlights sweeping back and forth across the road surface, checking for fresh tire tracks or other signs of recent activity. "This is better," he said as we pulled into the clearing. "We can park here, about 50 feet back from the road, and start our hike from that trailhead over there." He pointed toward a barely visible break in the trees, where a worn path disappeared into the darkness. But as we climbed out of the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't left our problems behind. The encounter with the SUV had left me on edge, and every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The forest around us was too quiet, missing the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife that should have been active this time of night. The trail was rougher than I'd expected, winding through dense underbrush that seemed to reach out and grab at our clothing as we passed. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, creating moving shadows that played tricks on our eyes and made every step feel uncertain. Pops led the way with the confident stride of someone who'd walked these mountains for decades, while Riley and I followed close behind, our breathing already becoming labored from the steep incline. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Under normal circumstances, it would have been perfect hiking weather, but tonight every breath felt charged with tension, every sound magnified by the darkness around us. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "You boys are jumpy tonight," Pops observed, though his voice carried a note of understanding rather than criticism. "It's natural to be more alert when you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Your other senses compensate, pick up things you might miss during the day." He was right. I could hear things I'd never noticed before: the subtle creaking of tree branches, the distant sound of water moving over rocks, the soft rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But underneath these natural sounds, there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We'd been hiking for about 30 minutes when we first heard the dog barking. It was a deep, aggressive sound that carried clearly through the still mountain air, coming from somewhere off to our left, maybe 300 feet away. All three of us stopped simultaneously, our flashlights instinctively sweeping in the direction of the sound. "That's not good," Pop said quietly, his hand moving to the emergency whistle hanging around his neck. "Dogs don't usually bark like that unless they're protecting something or warning someone about intruders." The barking continued, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. It was impossible to tell whether the dog was loose or restrained, whether it was alone or with its owner. But there was something unsettling about the persistence of it, the way it seemed to follow us as we continued down the trail. "Should we turn back?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. His usual enthusiasm had been replaced by a wariness that matched my own growing unease. "Let's give it a few more minutes," Pops decided. "If it doesn't stop or if it gets closer, we'll head back to the truck. But right now, it sounds like it's staying in one place, which suggests it's probably tied up." We continued hiking, but the barking had changed the entire dynamic of our trip. What had started as a peaceful evening walk had become something more tense, more uncertain. I found myself listening for other sounds, human voices, the sound of approaching footsteps, anything that might suggest we weren't alone in these mountains. The trail curved sharply to the right, following the contour of the hillside, and for a moment the barking faded to a distant echo. I allowed myself to relax slightly, thinking perhaps we'd put enough distance between ourselves and whatever was causing the disturbance, but then the sound returned, louder than before, and definitely closer. "That dog is moving," Pop said, stopping abruptly, "and it's coming this way." We stood in silence, listening to the approaching barks. They were getting closer, definitely getting closer, and now I could hear other sounds mixed in. The crash of something large moving through the underbrush, the snap of breaking branches, and underneath it all, what sounded like human voices. "We're leaving," Pops announced, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Right now." We turned around and began retracing our steps, moving faster than we'd moved on the way up. The barking followed us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always present. It was like being hunted, tracked by something we couldn't see but could definitely hear. As we hurried back down the trail, I couldn't help but think about Pops's warnings about drug activity in the area. Were we stumbling into something we weren't supposed to see? Had our innocent night hike brought us into contact with people who had reasons to avoid being discovered? The answers to those questions would come soon enough, but not in the way any of us expected. The return journey to the truck felt endless. Every step seemed to take us farther from safety rather than closer to it, and the barking continued to follow us, sometimes echoing from one direction, sometimes from another, as if we were being surrounded. My heart hammered against my ribs as we picked our way down the rocky trail, our flashlights creating wild patterns of light and shadow that made it impossible to judge distances or identify potential threats. Pops had taken the lead, his 73-year-old body moving with surprising agility over the rough terrain. Years of hiking these mountains had left him with an instinctive understanding of how to navigate in the dark, where to place his feet to avoid loose rocks, which branches to duck under, and how to read the subtle changes in the trail surface that indicated obstacles ahead. "Almost there," he called back to us, his voice barely carrying over the sound of our labored breathing. "Another few hundred yards and we'll be back at the truck." But as we rounded the final curve in the trail, the beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, parked directly behind Pops's truck, was a vehicle with its headlights on and its engine running. Even from a distance of nearly 1,000 feet, I could tell it was the same black SUV we'd encountered at the first trail. "Stop," Pops hissed, grabbing both Riley and me by the arm. "Get down and turn off your flashlights." We crouched behind a large boulder beside the trail, plunging ourselves into complete darkness. The sudden transition from light to dark left me temporarily blind, but my other senses immediately sharpened. I could hear the distant rumble of the SUV's engine, the continued barking of the dog somewhere in the forest behind us, and the rapid, shallow breathing of my companions. "How did they know we were here?" Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. "They followed us," Pops replied grimly. "Or they had someone watching the road, waiting to see where we went after we left the first trail. Either way, we're in trouble." The implications of our situation began to sink in. We were trapped on a remote mountain trail, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want us there, with no way to reach our vehicle and no cell phone coverage to call for help. The darkness that had seemed like a minor inconvenience now felt like a prison, hiding dangers we couldn't see or prepare for. "What do we do?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the terror coursing through my system. "We wait," Pop said. "And we watch. Maybe they'll get bored and leave." But even as he spoke, I could tell he didn't believe it. There was something deliberate about the way they'd positioned themselves, something that suggested they were prepared to wait us out. They knew we had to come back eventually, and they were patient enough to wait for us to make the first move. Through the darkness, I could make out the faint glow of the SUV's headlights illuminating the area around our truck. The vehicle was positioned at an angle that would allow its occupants to see anyone approaching from the trail, but also provided them with a quick escape route if necessary. It was the kind of tactical positioning that suggested these weren't amateurs. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The barking behind us had stopped, but somehow that felt more ominous than when it had been constant. Had they called off their dog? Were they moving into position around us? Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound carried the possibility of discovery. Then, to my absolute horror, the SUV began to move. Instead of backing up and leaving as we'd hoped, it drove around our truck and started heading directly toward us down the trail. The headlights swept back and forth across the narrow dirt road, searching for signs of our presence. "Move!" Pops commanded, his voice urgent but still controlled. "Up the hill behind that fallen log." We scrambled up the steep slope to our right, our hands and feet finding purchase on roots and rocks as we climbed. The log Pops had spotted was massive, probably an old oak that had fallen during a storm, and it provided perfect concealment from anyone on the trail below. We threw ourselves behind it just as the SUV's headlights swept across our former position. From our hiding spot, we had a clear view of the trail below. The SUV moved slowly, its windows down, and I could see the silhouettes of at least 2 people inside. They were scanning the forest methodically, their heads turning back and forth as they searched for any sign of movement. The SUV crept down the trail with predatory patience, its headlights sweeping from side to side like the eyes of some massive nocturnal predator. From our position behind the fallen log, we could see everything. The deliberate way they were searching, the way they paused at every potential hiding spot, the way they seemed to be communicating with each other through gestures and whispered words that didn't carry up to our position. My body was pressed against the rough bark of the log, every muscle tense with the effort of remaining perfectly still. A single cough, a shifted position, even the wrong kind of breathing could give us away. The October air, which had felt comfortable during our hike, now seemed to bite at my exposed skin as adrenaline made me hyper-aware of every sensation. Pops lay between Riley and me, his military training evident in the way he'd positioned himself to watch the threat below while keeping us protected. His weathered hands gripped the night vision binoculars, though he didn't dare raise them to his eyes while the SUV's headlights might catch the reflection of the lenses. Instead, he watched with the naked eye, his decades of experience in these mountains giving him an advantage over the hunters below. "They're looking for tracks," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "See how they're stopping at every muddy spot? They're trying to figure out how far up the trail we went." The SUV paused about 50 feet below our position, and I could hear the engine idle drop as they shifted into park. Car doors opened with the distinctive creak of old hinges, and I watched in growing terror as two figures emerged from the vehicle. They were both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps, their faces hidden in shadow, but their movements spoke of people who were comfortable operating in the darkness. One of them carried a powerful flashlight, the kind used by law enforcement or military personnel, while the other held what looked like a radio or cell phone. They began walking slowly along the trail, their lights sweeping back and forth across the ground, clearly following some kind of trail sign that we'd inadvertently left behind. Tracks, Pops mouthed silently, pointing toward the muddy section of trail where we'd walked earlier. Even from our elevated position, I could see the clear impressions our boots had left in the soft earth. The two men followed our tracks with the methodical precision of experienced trackers. They moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to examine the ground or confer with each other in voices too low for us to hear. But their body language was clear. They were getting closer to finding us. As they approached the spot where we'd left the trail to climb up the hillside, I felt my heart rate spike to levels that made my vision blur around the edges. The muddy area where we'd scrambled up the slope would show clear signs of disturbance, and from there it would be a simple matter to follow our path to the fallen log. When they find our tracks going up the hill, Pops whispered, his voice barely audible, "We move, quietly but quickly. There's another trail about 100 yards that way." He pointed deeper into the forest, away from our current position. The man with the flashlight reached the base of our hill and immediately stopped. His light swept across the disturbed earth where we'd climbed, and I could see him gesture to his companion. They'd found our escape route. "Now," Pops breathed. We began moving, staying low and trying to step only on solid ground that wouldn't show our passage. The fallen log had been our salvation, but now it was about to become our prison if we didn't move quickly enough. Behind us, I could hear the two men beginning their own climb up the hillside, their progress marked by the snap of breaking branches and the soft thud of boots on earth. The forest around us was a maze of trees, rocks, and underbrush that seemed designed to trip us up and slow our progress. Without flashlights, we were moving almost entirely by feel, our hands extended in front of us to avoid walking into trees, our feet testing each step before committing our full weight. But our pursuers had no such limitations. Their flashlights cut through the darkness like swords, and I could see the beams getting closer to our position. They were moving faster than we were, more confident in their ability to navigate the terrain, and they clearly had experience in this kind of pursuit. "The trail," Pops gasped, pointing toward a break in the trees that I couldn't see but had to trust was there. 50 more yards. Those 50 yards felt like 50 miles. Every step was a gamble, every breath a risk of discovery. The flashlight beams were getting closer, and I could hear voices now, not words, but the tone and cadence of people coordinating a search. The secondary trail Pops had mentioned was little more than a deer path, barely wide enough for single file and carpeted with fallen leaves that rustled with every step. In daylight, it would have been challenging to follow. In the darkness, with adrenaline making our movements clumsy and fear making every shadow seem like a threat, it was nearly impossible. We stumbled through the underbrush like drunken men, our hands constantly extended to feel for obstacles, our feet testing each step before committing our weight. Behind us, the pursuit continued, marked by the sweep of flashlight beams and the occasional crack of branches as our hunters made their way through the forest. "They're not giving up," Riley whispered, his voice tight with exhaustion and fear. We'd been moving for what felt like hours, though it had probably been less than 30 minutes. The physical exertion of climbing through rough terrain in complete darkness was taking its toll on all of us. Pops paused ahead of us, his hand raised in a gesture for silence. We froze, listening to the sounds of the night around us. The forest had gone quiet. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife had been stilled by the presence of too many humans moving through their territory. "There," Pops pointed toward a faint glow visible through the trees. "That's the main road. If we can get there, we can flag down help." But as we watched, the glow began to move. It wasn't stationary lighting from the road. It was the headlights of a vehicle moving slowly along the mountain highway. And as it drew closer, I could see that it was searching, its headlights sweeping back and forth across the forest edge just as the SUV had done on the trail. They have more people, I realized with growing horror. They're not just following us on foot. They have someone watching the road. The implications were terrifying. We weren't dealing with opportunistic criminals who had stumbled across our presence. This was coordinated, planned, and executed with a level of organization that suggested serious criminal activity. We had walked into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple drug operation. "How many of them are there?" Riley asked, voicing what we were all thinking. "Doesn't matter," Pops replied grimly. "We need to find another way out." But our options were rapidly disappearing. The terrain around us was becoming increasingly difficult. Steep slopes covered with loose rocks that would create noise with every step, dense thickets that would slow our progress to a crawl, and areas of exposed rock that would leave clear tracks for our pursuers to follow. The vehicle on the road had stopped directly opposite our position, its headlights now stationary and pointed into the forest. I could see figures moving around the vehicle, and what looked like the distinctive outline of someone setting up some kind of equipment. "Night vision," Pop said, recognizing what I was seeing. "They're setting up night vision equipment to scan the forest." The technology gap between us and our pursuers was becoming apparent. We had 3 small flashlights that we couldn't use without giving away our position, while they had powerful searchlights, night vision equipment, and multiple vehicles. It was like being hunted by a military unit while armed with nothing but our wits and our knowledge of the terrain. "There's a creek about half a mile that way," Pops pointed toward what looked like impenetrable darkness. "If we can get there, we can follow it downstream. Water won't hold our tracks, and the sound of moving water will mask our movement." Half a mile had never sounded so far. The terrain between us and the creek was some of the roughest in the area. Steep slopes, thick underbrush, and multiple rocky outcroppings that would be treacherous to navigate in daylight, let alone in complete darkness, while being pursued by people with superior equipment and numbers. But we had no choice. The alternative was to remain in place and hope our pursuers would give up, which seemed increasingly unlikely given the resources they were putting into finding us. Or we could try to surrender, but given what we'd stumbled into, that seemed like an option that would end badly for all of us. "Stay close," Pops instructed, "and whatever happens, don't make any noise. They're listening for us now." We began moving again, this time with even more caution than before. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. The darkness around us was complete, forcing us to rely on senses that felt inadequate for the task at hand. Behind us, the search continued. I could hear voices calling to each other, the sound of vehicles moving along the road, and the occasional crack of someone moving through the underbrush. They were methodical, professional, and persistent, and they were getting closer. The sound of running water reached us before we could see the creek, a gentle babbling that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of our flight. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, the promise of the creek represented both hope and terror. Hope, because it offered a way to move without leaving tracks. Terror, because reaching it meant crossing exposed ground where we would be vulnerable to the night vision equipment our pursuers were using. The creek was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 3 feet wide and maybe a foot deep, running over smooth stones that had been polished by decades of mountain runoff. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful spot, the kind of place where you might stop during a day hike to rest and enjoy the sounds of nature. Tonight, it represented our only chance of escape. "Get in the water," Pops instructed, his voice barely audible over the sound of the current. "Walk in the center. Try not to splash. The water will hide our scent from any dogs they might bring in." The water was shockingly cold, even through our hiking boots. October mountain water carries the bite of approaching winter, and within seconds my feet began to go numb. But the discomfort was nothing compared to the relief of knowing we were leaving no tracks for our pursuers to follow. We moved downstream in single file, Pops leading the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had spent his life in these mountains. The creek bed was treacherous, loose stones that shifted underfoot, sudden drops that could send you tumbling, and overhanging branches that seemed to reach out from the darkness to grab at our clothing. "This creek connects to the main river about 2 miles downstream," Pops explained in a whisper. "There's a bridge there, and a road that leads back to town. If we can make it that far, we can get help." 2 miles had never sounded so far. Every step was a battle against the current, the cold, and the darkness. My feet were completely numb now, and I could feel the beginning of hypothermia creeping into my legs. But behind us, the search continued, and the alternative to pressing on was unthinkable. As we followed the creek downstream, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The organized nature of our pursuit, the multiple vehicles, the professional equipment. This wasn't random criminal activity. We had stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Pops," I whispered during a brief stop to rest. "What do you think they're doing out here?" His face was grim in the faint starlight. "I think we found one of those manufacturing operations I've been reporting to the sheriff, and I think they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect it." The implications were chilling. We weren't just dealing with drug dealers or petty criminals. We were dealing with people who had invested serious resources in their operation, people who had too much to lose to let witnesses walk away. "The dog we heard earlier," Riley said suddenly, "it wasn't just barking at us, it was alerting them to our presence." That made sense. The persistent barking, the way it had seemed to follow us, the way it had stopped just before the SUV appeared. It had all been coordinated. We had walked into a trap that had been set long before we'd even decided to go hiking. "They've been watching the trails," Pops realized, "probably for weeks or months. Anyone who gets too close to their operation becomes a target." The creek curved sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the mountain. As we rounded the bend, I could see lights in the distance, not the searching beams of our pursuers, but the steady glow of civilization, street lights, house lights, the blessed promise of safety and help. "The bridge," Pops pointed toward a structure barely visible in the darkness. "We're almost there." But as we approached the bridge, I could see that our ordeal wasn't over. Parked at the near end of the bridge was another vehicle, this one with its headlights off but its engine running. Someone was waiting for us. "They anticipated this," Pops said grimly. "They knew about the creek, knew where it led. They've been herding us toward this point." We were trapped again, caught between the pursuers behind us and the trap ahead. The creek that had seemed like our salvation now felt like a channel leading us directly into the hands of people who wished us harm. "What do we do now?" Riley asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion and fear we all felt. Pops was quiet for a long moment, weighing our options. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers getting closer, their search moving systematically down the mountainside toward the creek. Ahead of us, the bridge represented both escape and capture. "We have one advantage," he said finally. "They don't know exactly where we are. They're covering the most obvious exit point, but they can't watch everywhere." He pointed toward the far bank of the creek where the terrain looked even more challenging than what we'd already crossed. "There's another trail over there, one that most people don't know about. It's steep and rough, but it leads to a different road, one they might not be watching." The decision to cross the creek and attempt the unknown trail felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. We were abandoning the familiar for the unknown, trading a difficult but manageable path for one that might prove impossible in our exhausted state. But as the lights of our pursuers grew closer and the trap at the bridge became more apparent, we had no choice but to take the gamble. The crossing was the most terrifying part of our entire ordeal. The creek was deeper here, reaching nearly to our knees, and the current was stronger as it approached the main river. Worse, we had to cross in the open, exposed to anyone watching from either direction. For 30 seconds, we would be completely vulnerable. "One at a time," Pops instructed. "I'll go first, then Riley, then you. If anyone gets spotted, the other two keep going no matter what." I watched Pops wade into the deeper water, his 73-year-old body moving with the careful precision of someone who knew that a single misstep could mean death. The current tugged at his legs, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his balance on the slippery stones of the creek bed. He made it across and immediately disappeared into the shadows of the far bank. Riley followed, younger and stronger, but less experienced in reading the treacherous footing. I held my breath as he navigated the deepest part of the crossing, where the water reached nearly to his waist. Then it was my turn. The water was shockingly cold, even after the numbing effect of walking in the creek for over an hour. The current was stronger than I'd expected, and the stones beneath my feet were covered with a slippery coating that made every step uncertain. Halfway across, I felt my right foot slip on a loose rock, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to fall. But I managed to regain my balance and push forward, reaching the far bank just as I heard the sound of voices from the direction we'd come. Our pursuers had reached the creek and were beginning to follow our trail downstream. "Here," Pops whispered, pointing toward what looked like a solid wall of vegetation. The trail starts behind those bushes. What he called a trail was almost invisible. A gap between trees that might have been created by deer or other wildlife, barely wide enough for a single person. It led upward at a steep angle, disappearing into the darkness of the forest canopy. "This is going to be rough," he warned. "It's about a mile straight up, and then another mile along the ridge before it connects to the old logging road. But it's our only chance." We began climbing immediately, knowing that every second we delayed gave our pursuers more time to organize their search. The trail was everything Pops had warned, and worse, steep enough to require the use of hands as well as feet, rocky enough to be treacherous in the dark, and overgrown enough to tear at our clothing and scratch our exposed skin. Behind us, I could hear the sound of our pursuers discovering our crossing point. Voices called out coordinates, engines revved as vehicles moved to new positions, and the systematic search began again. But this time, we had a head start and the advantage of knowing where we were going. The climb was brutal. My legs, already exhausted from hours of hiking and wading through cold water, screamed in protest with every step. My lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the thin mountain air, and my hands were torn and bleeding from grabbing at rocks and tree roots for support. But fear is a powerful motivator, and the knowledge that capture might mean death kept us moving even when our bodies wanted to stop. We climbed in silence, saving our breath for the physical effort, communicating only through gestures and the occasional whispered warning about obstacles ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the trail began to level out. We had reached the ridge, and through the trees, I could see the lights of the valley spread out below us. Somewhere down there was civilization, safety, and help. But we still had to get there. "The logging road is just ahead," Pops gasped, his voice showing the strain of the climb. "Once we reach it, it's all downhill to the main highway." The logging road was a blessed relief, wide enough for vehicles, smooth enough for relatively easy walking, and familiar enough that we could move with more confidence. We began jogging despite our exhaustion, knowing that we were racing against time and the organizational abilities of our pursuers. As we rounded a curve in the road, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life. The headlights of a sheriff's department patrol car moving slowly up the road toward us. Pops pulled out his emergency whistle and began blowing it in the pattern that indicated distress, the sound echoing off the mountains around us. The patrol car stopped, and I could see the officer inside speaking rapidly into his radio. Within minutes, the quiet mountain road was filled with the lights and sounds of law enforcement vehicles, paramedics, and search and rescue teams. "We found something," one of the deputies reported after taking our statement. "A major methamphetamine manufacturing operation about 2 miles from where you started your hike. We've arrested 6 people so far, and we found enough equipment and chemicals to supply half the state." We had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple drug operation. We had discovered a criminal enterprise that had been operating in the mountains for months, using the remote trails to transport supplies and finished products while staying hidden from law enforcement. "You boys are lucky to be alive," the sheriff told us as paramedics checked us for injuries. "These people have been responsible for at least 3 disappearances in the area over the past year. People who got too close to their operation and were never seen again." As we sat in the back of the ambulance, warming ourselves with emergency blankets and hot coffee, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to becoming statistics ourselves. A few wrong decisions, a little less luck, a little less knowledge of the terrain, and we would have joined the ranks of people who had ventured into the mountains and never returned. The mountains of northern Georgia are beautiful, peaceful, and full of opportunities for outdoor recreation. But they also hold secrets, and some of those secrets are darker than others. Our annual hiking trip had taught us that the wilderness can be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with wildlife or weather, and that sometimes the greatest threat in the mountains walks on 2 legs and carries a flashlight. We never did finish that night hike. But we lived to tell the story, and sometimes that's the best ending you can hope for. I remember the spring of 2014 vividly, when I was 14 years old and in my final year at St. Agnes Catholic Elementary School in Burlington, Ontario. Our lakeside city, nestled comfortably between Hamilton and Toronto, had always felt safe and predictable. The biggest excitement most of us experienced was the occasional storm rolling in from Lake Ontario, but even those seemed tame compared to what awaited us. Every year, the 8th grade students at our school looked forward to 2 traditional trips. The first, in autumn, was a mandatory religious retreat about 40 minutes from the city. 3 days of forced participation in Christian fellowship activities that none of us particularly enjoyed. It was essentially an extended religion class, disguised as camping, complete with morning prayers, Bible study sessions, and team-building exercises that revolved around faith and moral character. The second trip, however, was the one we all anticipated, a weekend in Ottawa during late spring. Previous classes had spent their time exploring Parliament Hill, visiting the Canadian Museum of History, and wandering through Byward Market. It was educational but fun, urban but manageable. We had spent months planning what we would do, which museums we would prioritize, what souvenirs we might buy. Then, in early March, our homeroom teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, made an announcement that changed everything. Due to budget constraints and scheduling conflicts with other schools, our Ottawa trip had been canceled. Instead, we would be taking a second camping trip, this one to Algonquin Provincial Park, approximately 4 hours north of Burlington. The collective groan that escaped from our classroom was audible down the hallway. Algonquin Park was wilderness, real wilderness, dense forests, isolated lakes, and minimal cell phone coverage. For a group of suburban kids who considered a power outage during a thunderstorm to be roughing it, this was devastating news. My stomach dropped particularly hard because my family had always been adamantly opposed to camping. My parents, both accountants who preferred their nature experiences to come with indoor plumbing and climate control, had successfully avoided any outdoor adventures throughout my childhood. The closest I had come to sleeping outdoors was the time our air conditioner broke during a July heat wave, and we had slept in the backyard for one night before my father caved and booked us into a hotel. Mrs. Kowalski tried to maintain enthusiasm as she described the camp facilities at Algonquin. There would be cabins, she assured us, not tents. There was a mess hall for meals, proper bathroom facilities, and organized activities led by experienced camp counselors. She made it sound almost civilized, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. This was uncharted territory for all of us. The weeks leading up to the trip were filled with anxious preparation. Parents organized shopping expeditions for sleeping bags, flashlights, and insect repellent. My mother, clearly as nervous as I was about the whole endeavor, purchased enough supplies to outfit a small expedition team. She packed multiple flashlights with extra batteries, industrial-strength bug spray, a first aid kit that could stock a small clinic, and enough non-perishable snacks to feed me for a week. My father, attempting to be supportive, shared stories of his own childhood camping experiences in northern Ontario with his grandfather. These tales, meant to be reassuring, instead filled me with dread. He described waking up to find raccoons had ransacked their campsite, getting lost on hiking trails that seemed to shift and change in the darkness, and the unsettling way sounds carried differently in the deep forest at night. The thing about being in real wilderness, he told me the night before we left, is that you remember you're not at the top of the food chain anymore. You're just another small creature trying to survive until morning. His words, intended as wisdom, settled into my chest like cold stones. The bus ride to Algonquin Park stretched endlessly through changing landscapes. We left Burlington's familiar suburbs behind, passing through small towns that grew progressively more rural, until eventually the spaces between buildings expanded into vast stretches of untamed forest. The trees seemed to press closer to the highway with each passing mile, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even the midday sun struggled to penetrate. My classmates' initial excitement gradually gave way to nervous energy as the civilization disappeared behind us. The usual chatter and laughter became forced, punctuated by long periods of silence as we stared out the windows at the seemingly endless wilderness. Even our most confident and outgoing students began to look uncertain. Camp Kitchikanichek sat on the shores of a lake so remote it didn't appear on most standard maps. The name, according to our counselor orientation packet, meant Place of Spirits in Algonquin, though no one seemed particularly eager to elaborate on that translation when we asked. As our bus rumbled down the narrow gravel access road, the first thing that struck me was the overwhelming silence. In Burlington, there was always background noise, Traffic, lawnmowers, neighbors, the distant hum of the QEW highway. Here, when our bus engine finally died, the quiet was so complete it felt oppressive, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The camp itself looked like it had been carved reluctantly from the surrounding wilderness. The main buildings, a large mess hall, bathroom facilities, and the camp office, were constructed from weathered logs that had darkened with age and moisture. They appeared to be barely holding their ground against the encroaching forest, as though nature was patiently waiting to reclaim what had been taken. The counselors who greeted us seemed friendly enough, but there was something in their manner that felt rehearsed, almost desperate. They smiled too widely and spoke too loudly, as though trying to convince themselves as much as us that this was going to be a wonderful experience. The head counselor, a tall man named Mr. Bramley, with prematurely gray hair and weathered hands, gave us the standard orientation speech about rules, safety, and the importance of staying together. But it was the way his eyes kept darting toward the tree line while he spoke that made me uneasy. The cabin assignments were read aloud in front of the mess hall. As Mrs. Kowalski had promised, boys and girls were housed separately. The girls' cabins were built on stilts near the lake, elevated above the ground with proper stairs and railings. They looked almost quaint, like something from a summer camp brochure, complete with window boxes and cheerful yellow paint. Our cabin assignments were different. The boys' cabins were situated further from the lake, closer to where the forest began to thicken into true wilderness. When they called my name along with 4 other boys, David, Kevin, Brett, and Connor, I felt a sinking sensation as we were directed toward the cabin furthest from the main camp area. Cabin 7 sat at the end of a winding gravel path, almost hidden among the trees. Unlike the girls' elevated structures, ours was built directly on the ground, constructed from what appeared to be mismatched lumber and materials salvaged from other projects. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the walls looked like they had been assembled by someone whose primary concern was speed rather than craftsmanship. The windows were nothing more than openings, covered with thin mesh screens that had several tiers and holes. The front door, painted a faded green that was peeling away in large flakes, hung slightly crooked on its hinges. When Connor tried to close it properly, it became clear that the door frame had warped over time, leaving a gap of nearly 2 inches along one side. "Well," David said, trying to maintain optimism as we surveyed our accommodations, "at least we won't have to worry about overheating." The interior was sparse but functional. 5 narrow beds with thin mattresses lined the walls, each with a small wooden shelf for personal belongings. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, controlled by a switch near the door that, when tested, produced only a weak flickering light that seemed to emphasize the shadows rather than eliminate them. But it was the silence that bothered me most. Even with 5 teenage boys unpacking and talking, our voices seemed to be absorbed by the walls, creating a muffled, distant quality that made normal conversation feel strained. Outside, the forest pressed close enough to the windows that we could see individual leaves and branches, creating the sensation that we were being watched by countless unseen eyes. As evening approached and we made our way to the mess hall for dinner, I noticed details that the initial orientation had glossed over. Scratches on some of the cabin walls that looked too deliberate to be accidental, posted signs that warned against wandering off alone, with consequences that seemed disproportionately severe for a school camping trip. And everywhere, the feeling that this place existed in uneasy cooperation with something much larger and less friendly than ourselves. The forest seemed to grow darker and more dense as the sun began to set, transforming from a pleasant backdrop into something that felt actively hostile. Trees that had appeared normal during daylight now loomed like sentries, their branches creating shapes and shadows that suggested movement where there should be none. Dinner in the mess hall that first evening was a subdued affair. The building itself was larger than it had appeared from outside, with long wooden tables arranged in rows, and a serving area that reminded me of our school cafeteria, only more primitive. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of previous camp groups, their faces bright with forced smiles that seemed somehow desperate when viewed in the flickering fluorescent lighting. The meal was simple but adequate: hamburgers, potato salad, and corn on the cob, though I noticed several of my classmates picking at their food without much appetite. The combination of nervous energy and the strange, almost medicinal taste of the lake water was making it difficult for anyone to eat normally. Mr. Bramley stood at the front of the hall as we finished eating, clapping his hands together to get our attention. The sound echoed strangely in the large space, seeming to hang in the air longer than it should have. "Now then," he began, his voice carrying that same forced enthusiasm I had noticed during our arrival. "We have a special evening activity planned for tonight. It's a camp tradition that we share with all our visiting groups." He paused, scanning our faces with an expression that I would later recognize as someone gauging an audience's readiness for something unpleasant. "You see, these woods have been home to many people over the years. Native tribes, fur traders, loggers, and even some folks who chose to make this wilderness their permanent home. One such person still lives here, deeper in the forest than most people ever venture." Several of my classmates exchanged glances. Mrs. Kowalski, sitting at the teacher's table, looked as though this was the first she was hearing of this particular tradition. "We call him the Hermit of Algonquin," Mr. Bramley continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a dramatic whisper. "He's been living out there for decades, completely self-sufficient, surviving off the land. He's harmless, of course, but he doesn't particularly enjoy company. Still, we like to take our brave campers on a little expedition to see where he's made his home." The mess hall had become completely quiet. Even the counselors seemed to be listening with unusual intensity. "Now, this isn't mandatory," Mr. Bramley added, though his tone suggested that refusing to participate would mark someone as a coward for the remainder of the trip. "But it's quite an experience. Very few people get to see how someone can truly live off the grid in wilderness like this." My stomach began to churn with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. The rational part of my mind recognized this as probably just an elaborate camp story designed to add excitement to what was otherwise a fairly mundane outdoor education experience. But something about Mr. Bramley's delivery and the way the other counselors were watching us suggested there was more truth to this story than I wanted to believe. "We'll be leaving in about 30 minutes, he announced. "Dress warmly, bring your flashlights, and remember, we stay together as a group. No wandering off, no matter what you might see or hear." The way he emphasized those last words made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As we returned to our cabins to prepare for the night expedition, the conversations among my classmates had taken on a different quality. The usual bravado and jokes were replaced by genuine nervousness and speculation about what we might encounter. Some students seemed excited by the prospect of adventure, while others looked like they were seriously considering claiming illness to avoid the whole experience. David, who had been appointed as our unofficial cabin leader due to his size and generally calm demeanor, tried to maintain group morale as we gathered our flashlights and extra clothing. "It's probably just some old guy who lives in a cabin," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're just trying to make it sound scary to give us a good story to tell when we get home." Kevin, who had been unusually quiet since our arrival, spoke up from his bed near the window. "My cousin went to a camp in Muskoka last summer. They had a similar story about someone living in the woods. Turned out it was just one of the counselors dressed up to scare the kids." This explanation seemed reasonable and helped settle some of our nerves. As we prepared to leave the cabin, Brett tested his flashlight for the third time, while Connor double-checked that he had extra batteries in his jacket pocket. But as we opened our poorly fitting door and stepped out into the evening air, the forest around us had transformed completely. What had been merely dense and uninviting during daylight had become something altogether more menacing. The trees seemed taller and more closely packed, their branches interweaving overhead to create a canopy so thick that stars were visible only in small patches. More disturbing was the quality of the darkness itself. It wasn't simply the absence of light, but seemed to have substance and weight, pressing against us from all directions. Our flashlight beams, which had seemed adequate when tested inside the cabin, now appeared weak and ineffective, creating small pools of visibility that only emphasized how much we couldn't see. The other groups were gathering near the mess hall, their own flashlights creating a constellation of moving lights that provided some comfort. But even with 30 students and several adults, we seemed like a very small presence in a very large and indifferent wilderness. Mr. Bramley appeared carrying a larger, more powerful flashlight that cast a broader beam than our smaller lights. He had changed into darker clothing and seemed more serious than he had during his dinner presentation. "Remember," he said as we began to move toward a trail that led directly into the forest, "stay close together. These woods can be confusing at night, and it's very easy to become disoriented. We're going to follow a specific path and we'll be back at camp within an hour. As we entered the forest proper, our flashlight beams began to reveal details that made the whole expedition feel increasingly surreal. Animal tracks in the mud that looked larger than anything I could identify, scratches on tree trunks that were too high and too deep to have been made by anything I wanted to encounter. And everywhere, the sense that we were being observed by creatures that were perfectly comfortable in an environment where we were completely out of our element. The path itself was barely visible, marked more by the absence of trees than by any actual trail maintenance. We walked single file, with counselors positioned at the front, middle, and rear of our group. The only sounds were our footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional whispered conversation that was quickly hushed by the adults. After what felt like much longer than the promised short walk, Mr. Bramley raised his hand for us to stop. Ahead, barely visible in the combined glow of our flashlights, was a structure that looked like something from a survival documentary. What we found in that small clearing defied every expectation I had formed during our walk through the forest. This wasn't the rustic cabin I had imagined, nor was it the elaborate campsite that might house someone choosing to live off the grid as a lifestyle experiment. Instead, we discovered something that looked like the desperate creation of someone who had been pushed far beyond the boundaries of normal human society. The structure, if it could even be called that, appeared to be built primarily from a massive fallen tree, easily 6 feet in diameter, that had been hollowed out and modified into a crude shelter. One end had been carefully carved away to create an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through, while the other end had been sealed with what looked like a mixture of mud, leaves, and materials I couldn't identify in the flashlight beams. Smaller logs and branches had been arranged around the main trunk to create walls and partitions, forming additional spaces that extended the living area. Everything was held together with rope, wire, and what appeared to be strips of fabric or leather. The construction showed clear evidence of both ingenuity and desperation. It was the work of someone who understood how to survive in the wilderness, but had been forced to do so with whatever materials they could find or create. But it was the details surrounding the main shelter that made the whole scene truly unsettling. Scattered throughout the clearing were dozens of smaller constructions, elaborate arrangements of sticks, stones, and bones that had been assembled into patterns that suggested meaning without making any sense. Some looked like warning markers, others resembled primitive art installations, and still others seemed to serve purposes that I couldn't begin to guess. Hanging from the trees around the perimeter were collections of objects that caught and reflected our flashlight beams in disturbing ways. Metal cans and pieces of glass had been arranged to create wind chimes that would catch even the slightest breeze, producing soft, dissonant sounds that seemed designed to alert the inhabitant to any approaching presence. Strips of fabric and plastic had been woven between branches to create barriers that would be impossible to pass through silently. "This is where he lives," Mr. Bramley whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and unease that was far different from his earlier theatrical delivery. "He's been out here for more than 20 years, completely self-sufficient." As our eyes adjusted and we examined the scene more carefully, the sophistication of the survival setup became more apparent. There were clear areas designated for different purposes: food preparation, tool storage, water collection. A complex system of tarps and carved channels directed rainwater into containers made from what looked like repurposed industrial materials. Everything showed signs of constant use and careful maintenance. But there were also details that suggested something beyond simple wilderness survival. Scratches and markings on many of the trees looked deliberately placed, forming patterns that might have been some kind of primitive communication system or territorial marking. Animal skulls and bones had been arranged in specific configurations that seemed too organized to be random, too purposeful to be mere decoration. "Does he know we're here?" asked one of the girls from the group ahead of us, her voice barely audible above the soft sounds of the wind chimes. "Oh, he knows," Mr. Bramley replied, and there was something in his tone that made several of us instinctively move closer together. "He always knows when people are in his territory, but he doesn't usually show himself unless he wants to be seen." As if summoned by those words, there was a sound from somewhere in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams, a soft rustling that could have been wind moving through branches, but carried a rhythm that suggested deliberate movement. Several of us immediately swung our lights toward the sound, but the beams revealed only more trees and deeper shadows. "We should head back now," Mr. Bramley announced, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by what sounded like genuine nervousness. "We've seen what we came to see." The return journey felt completely different from our approach. Where the walk into the forest had been filled with anticipatory anxiety, the walk back was charged with the feeling that we were being followed. Every few minutes, someone would hear a sound, a branch breaking, leaves rustling, or what might have been footsteps, that would cause the entire group to pause and listen before continuing. My own senses seemed heightened to an almost painful degree. Every shadow suggested movement, every sound carried the possibility of threat. The forest, which had merely felt unfamiliar during our approach, now felt actively hostile, as though our presence had disturbed something that was better left undisturbed. David, walking beside me, was the first to voice what several of us were thinking. "Did you see anyone back there?" he whispered. I kept thinking I saw someone moving around the edges of the clearing. I had experienced the same sensation, brief glimpses of movement that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. It was impossible to tell whether we had actually seen anything or whether our imaginations had been influenced by the strange environment and Mr. Bramley's storytelling. "Probably just shadows," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. Connor, who had been walking behind us, caught up and joined our whispered conversation. The counselors seemed nervous too. "Did you notice how quickly they wanted to leave once we got there?" It was true. The adults who had seemed confident and in control during the dinner presentation had appeared genuinely unsettled by the time we reached the hermit's dwelling. Their jokes and casual comments had stopped completely, replaced by the focused attention of people who were operating in an environment where dangers were real and immediate. As we finally emerged from the forest and could see the lights of the camp buildings ahead, there was a collective sense of relief that was impossible to hide. Students who had been trying to maintain brave facades throughout the expedition now openly expressed their eagerness to be back in civilization, such as it was. But even as we gathered in the mess hall for hot chocolate and a debriefing session, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back from the forest. Not necessarily the hermit himself, but something, a presence, an awareness, a sense of being observed that had attached itself to our group during our visit to that strange clearing. Mrs. Kowalski, who had remained notably quiet during the entire expedition, asked Mr. Bramley a question that several of us had been wondering about. "How often does this hermit actually interact with the camp? Does he ever come closer to the main facilities?" Mr. Bramley's pause before answering was just long enough to be noticeable. "Well," he said, "he keeps to himself mostly. But he does move around his territory quite a bit, especially at night. Sometimes campers hear him, or catch glimpses of him near the edges of the camp. It's nothing to worry about. He's never actually bothered anyone." The way he phrased that response, focusing on what the hermit had never done rather than what he might do, stayed with me as we made our way back to our cabins for the night. The wind picked up shortly after we returned to our cabin, creating sounds that transformed the forest from merely unsettling to actively threatening. What had seemed like ordinary forest noises during daylight now carried suggestions of movement and intent that made normal conversation impossible. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. Every creaking branch suggested someone or something moving just outside our field of vision. My bed, positioned directly beside the door that refused to close properly, offered a clear view of the gap where wind and whatever else might be outside could enter freely. The thin mesh covering our windows provided no sense of security, serving more as a reminder of how vulnerable we were than as any kind of barrier. David, ever practical, had suggested we try to secure the door more effectively by wedging one of the wooden chairs against it. The solution was only partially successful. While it prevented the door from swinging open completely, it still allowed the wind to rattle it constantly, creating a rhythmic banging that seemed designed to prevent anyone from falling asleep. "This is ridiculous," Brett muttered from his bed across the cabin. "How do they expect anyone to sleep with all this noise?" Kevin, who had been lying quietly on his back staring at the ceiling, sat up suddenly. "Did you guys hear that?" We all stopped talking and listened. Over the constant sound of wind and rattling door, there was something else, a rhythmic crunching that sounded like footsteps on the gravel path outside. It's probably just one of the counselors doing a security check, Connor suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. The footsteps, if that's what they were, passed by our cabin and continued down the path toward the forest. But instead of fading into the distance, they seemed to stop somewhere just beyond the range of normal hearing. For several minutes, we lay in our beds listening intently, but heard nothing more. I must have eventually fallen asleep because I was awakened sometime later by a sound that was distinctly different from the wind and forest noises that had been our constant background. This was definitely footsteps, but they were moving much more slowly and deliberately than the ones we had heard earlier. The sound was coming from directly outside our cabin, moving around the perimeter in a pattern that suggested someone was examining our shelter with great care. The footsteps would pause for long periods, sometimes directly outside our windows, before moving to the next position. My heart was beating so hard I was certain it would be audible to whoever was outside. The gap in our door seemed enormous now, and the mesh over our windows felt as substantial as tissue paper. If someone wanted to enter our cabin, there was absolutely nothing preventing them from doing so. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I could hear my own breathing, amplified by fear and the strange acoustics of our thin-walled shelter. From the complete silence in the other beds, I could tell that my cabin mates were also awake and listening, though none of us dared to speak or move. Through the gap in the door, I could see a shadow that suggested someone was standing just outside, close enough that I should have been able to hear breathing or other sounds of a living person. But there was only silence, broken occasionally by the soft sounds of the wind chimes we had seen at the hermit's dwelling. The realization that those sounds were coming from directly outside our cabin, rather than from the distant forest, made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the presence remained outside our door. Then, gradually, the footsteps resumed, moving around to the back of our cabin before disappearing into the forest. None of us spoke for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, bringing with it the normal sounds of a camp awakening, the events of the previous night felt almost like a shared nightmare. But when we opened our door to head to breakfast, we found clear evidence that our experience had been entirely real. In the soft earth around our cabin were footprints, not the boot prints of counselors or the sneaker impressions that would have been left by students, but bare human footprints that were significantly larger than any of ours. The prints showed clear evidence of someone who had walked completely around our cabin multiple times, pausing at each window and spending considerable time directly in front of our door. But most disturbing were the small objects that had been left at various points around our cabin's perimeter. Arrangements of sticks, stones, and what looked like animal bones had been placed outside each window and beside the door. They were clearly deliberate constructions, similar to what we had seen at the hermit's dwelling, but their meaning was impossible to determine. David, who had maintained his role as our unofficial leader, was the first to examine the evidence more closely. "We need to tell the counselors about this," he said, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure that would help. "Tell them what?" Kevin asked. "That someone walked around our cabin at night? They'll probably just say it was a security check." "Security checks don't involve leaving weird stick sculptures," Connor pointed out. As we made our way to the mess hall for breakfast, I noticed that we weren't the only group showing signs of a sleepless night. Several other students looked haggard and nervous, and conversations were punctuated by frequent glances toward the forest. When Mrs. Kowalski asked how everyone had slept, the responses were telling. Multiple students reported hearing unusual sounds during the night: footsteps, rustling, and what one girl described as someone testing the doors and windows of our cabin. Mr. Bramley, when informed of these various incidents, maintained that such experiences were normal for people unaccustomed to wilderness camping. "The forest is very much alive at night," he explained. "Lots of animals move around after dark, and sounds carry differently out here than they do in urban environments. It's easy for imagination to transform normal forest activities into something threatening." But I noticed that he avoided making eye contact with any of us as he offered these explanations, and his reassurances seemed designed more to convince himself than to comfort us. The second day at Camp Kitchikinichek brought activities designed to familiarize us with wilderness survival: compass navigation, identification of edible plants, and basic shelter construction. Under normal circumstances, these might have been interesting and educational experiences. However, the events of the previous night had fundamentally changed the atmosphere of our group. Where we had initially approached the camping experience with typical teenage concerns about comfort and convenience, we now found ourselves genuinely worried about our safety. The forest, which had seemed like an inconvenient backdrop to our school trip, now felt like an active presence that was watching and evaluating us with purposes we couldn't understand. During the morning compass navigation exercise, our group was assigned to a section of forest about a quarter mile from the main camp. The activity itself was straightforward. Follow a series of compass bearings to locate markers that had been placed along a predetermined route. What made the experience unsettling was the constant sense that we were being observed by someone other than our supervising counselor. Movement in peripheral vision became a constant distraction. Each time one of us would turn to investigate what appeared to be a figure moving through the trees, we would find only ordinary forest, trunks, branches, and shadows that could have concealed anything. But the feeling of being watched never diminished, and by the time we completed the exercise, all 5 members of our group were constantly looking over our shoulders. "There's definitely someone following us," Brett whispered during one of our compass readings. "I keep seeing the same figure moving parallel to our route." David, still trying to maintain rational explanations for our experiences, suggested that it might be another counselor conducting their own activities in the same area. But when we mentioned this possibility to our supervisor, she seemed genuinely surprised and confirmed that no other groups were scheduled to be working in that section of forest. The afternoon plant identification session took place in a meadow closer to the main camp, which should have felt safer and more comfortable. However, the open space created its own form of anxiety. While we could see much more of our surroundings, we could also be seen much more easily by anyone watching from the forest perimeter. Throughout the session, as we learned to distinguish between edible and poisonous berries, several students reported seeing figures moving among the trees at the edge of the meadow. These sightings were always brief and unclear: a flash of movement, a shape that didn't match the patterns of the forest, or what appeared to be someone quickly moving out of sight when looked at directly. Our instructor, a local naturalist who had been hired to supplement the camp's regular staff, seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the afternoon progressed. When asked about wildlife in the area, she mentioned that while black bears and wolves were present in Algonquin Park, they typically avoided areas with human activity. "The animals you really need to be aware of," she said, glancing toward the forest edge, "are the ones that aren't afraid of people. Those can be much more unpredictable." The way she emphasized the word animals suggested she might not be referring exclusively to wildlife. As evening approached and we returned to the main camp for dinner, the atmosphere among both students and staff had become noticeably strained. Conversations were quieter and more serious than they had been the previous day, and there was a general reluctance to discuss plans for after dark. When Mr. Bramley announced that the evening's activity would be a campfire program featuring ghost stories and traditional camp songs, the response from our group was notably unenthusiastic. The idea of sitting in a circle of firelight while surrounded by dark forest held no appeal for students who had spent the day feeling watched and followed. "Actually," Mrs. Kowalski interjected, "I think our group might prefer some quiet time in the cabins this evening. It's been a long day and everyone seems a bit tired." The relief on the faces of my classmates was obvious, though several of the counselors seemed disappointed by our lack of interest in the planned activities. As we prepared to return to our cabins after dinner, I overheard part of a conversation between Mr. Bramley and another counselor that increased my unease about the entire situation. "They're more active this year," the second counselor was saying. "Usually we only get reports during the first night or two, but this group has been having encounters throughout the day as well." "It's probably just because they're more observant," Mr. Bramley replied, but his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own explanation. "Urban kids aren't used to wilderness environments. They notice things that rural kids would just accept as normal." "Maybe," the other counselor said. "But some of the staff have been seeing things too. And those arrangements around the cabins, that's new behavior." I didn't hear the rest of their conversation, but what I had overheard confirmed that the strange experiences weren't limited to our overactive imaginations. The camp staff were clearly aware that something unusual was happening, and their attempts to normalize the situation were becoming increasingly unconvincing. Back in Cabin 7, we attempted to create a more secure environment for the night. Using our sleeping bags and extra clothing, we covered the mesh windows to create more privacy and block the view from outside. The chair barricade against the door was reinforced with our backpacks and anything else that might make forced entry more difficult. These preparations were largely symbolic. Anyone determined to enter our cabin could have done so easily, regardless of our improvised security measures. But the activity of fortifying our shelter provided some psychological comfort and gave us a sense of taking active steps to protect ourselves. As darkness fell, the forest sounds began again, but this time they seemed more organized and purposeful. Instead of random wind and animal noises, there were patterns that suggested coordination, sounds that would start in one area of the forest and then be answered from another location, as though different individuals were communicating across the darkness. "It's like they're setting up positions around the camp," Kevin observed from his position near the covered window. The thought that we might be surrounded by unknown individuals operating with coordination and purpose was more terrifying than the idea of a single hermit wandering randomly through the forest. It suggested planning, intelligence, and objectives that we couldn't begin to understand. Around midnight, the footsteps returned to our cabin, but this time they were accompanied by sounds that made it clear we were dealing with more than one person. Multiple sets of feet moved around our shelter, and there were soft sounds that might have been whispered conversations conducted in voices too low for us to understand. But most disturbing was the systematic testing of our improvised security measures. Something or someone carefully examined each of our covered windows, applying gentle pressure to determine how easily our barriers could be removed. The door received similar attention, with the sound of hands testing the strength of our barricade and exploring the gap that we hadn't been able to eliminate completely. Throughout this examination, none of us dared to move or speak. We lay motionless in our beds, hoping that stillness might convince our visitors that the cabin was empty or that its occupants were deeply asleep. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds gradually moved away from our immediate area, but they didn't disappear entirely. For the rest of the night, we could hear evidence of similar investigations being conducted at other cabins throughout the camp, along with the continued communication sounds from various points in the surrounding forest. When morning finally arrived, we discovered that our cabin had received the same treatment as the previous night. Small constructions of sticks, stones, and bones placed at strategic points around our shelter. But this time, the arrangements were more elaborate and seemed to follow a more complex pattern that extended beyond our individual cabin to encompass the entire camp area. The third day of our camping trip dawned gray and misty, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to emerge directly from the forest itself rather than falling from the sky. The weather matched the mood of our group perfectly. Subdued, apprehensive, and focused primarily on the prospect of returning home the following morning. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with students speaking in hushed tones and frequently glancing toward the windows of the mess hall. The normal complaints about camp food and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements had been replaced by more serious discussions about the strange events of the previous nights and growing speculation about what might happen during our final evening at Camp Kitchikanichek. Mrs. Kowalski appeared increasingly concerned about our group's state of mind. During a brief teachers' meeting that we could observe through the mess hall windows, there was obvious disagreement between our school staff and the camp counselors about how to address the situation. Hand gestures and facial expressions suggested that Mrs. Kowalski was arguing for cutting our trip short, while Mr. Bramley seemed to be insisting that everything was normal and under control. The day's planned activities, a nature hike followed by an afternoon of canoeing on the lake, were presented as opportunities to restore our appreciation for the wilderness environment. However, the underlying purpose seemed to be keeping our group occupied and away from the camp during daylight hours, when the mysterious watchers were presumably less active. The nature hike took us along a trail that paralleled the lakeshore, keeping us in open areas where visibility was good and the forest couldn't press too close. Even so, the sense of being observed remained constant. Our guide, a different naturalist than the previous day, seemed nervous and kept the group moving at a faster pace than was typical for educational hikes. "Are there other people living in this forest besides the hermit you told us about?" one of the girls asked during a rest stop. The guide's hesitation before answering was telling. "Well, Algonquin is a large park," she said carefully. "There are various research stations, fire towers, and maintenance facilities scattered throughout the area. It's possible you might see park workers or researchers from time to time. but her explanation didn't account for the organized nature of what we had been experiencing or the deliberate arrangements being left around our cabins. Park workers conducting legitimate activities wouldn't need to operate exclusively under cover of darkness, and they certainly wouldn't be leaving cryptic messages constructed from forest debris. The afternoon canoeing session provided our first real relief from the constant tension. Out on the open water, with clear sightlines in all directions and the forest reduced to a distant perimeter, we could finally relax enough to enjoy ourselves. The physical activity and change of environment helped restore some sense of normalcy to what had become an increasingly surreal experience. But even during this respite, there were reminders that we remained under observation. Several times during our paddle around the lake, students reported seeing figures moving along the distant shoreline, always too far away to identify clearly, but obviously human and apparently tracking our movement across the water. "They're making sure we don't try to leave by water," David observed quietly as we paddled back toward the camp's dock. The possibility that our mysterious watchers were actively preventing our departure, rather than simply monitoring our presence, added a new dimension of concern to an already frightening situation. What had initially seemed like curious observation by a reclusive hermit was beginning to feel more like deliberate containment by individuals with unknown but clearly organized intentions. As we returned to shore and began securing the canoes, I noticed that the camp counselors were conducting what appeared to be a security check of the entire facility. Small groups of staff members were systematically examining each building, looking under structures, checking window and door fastenings, and having quiet conferences about their findings. When Mrs. Kowalski asked Mr. Bramley about these activities, his explanation was characteristically vague. "Just routine maintenance checks," he said. "We like to make sure everything is secure, especially when we're hosting school groups." But the timing and intensity of these maintenance checks suggested that the camp staff were as concerned about the night ahead as we were. Dinner was followed by an indoor movie in the mess hall, a nature documentary that was clearly intended to keep everyone in a single, well-lit location for as long as possible. However, the choice of film backfired somewhat, as it featured extended segments about predatory animals and survival challenges in wilderness environments that only reinforced our existing anxieties. As the documentary concluded and we prepared to return to our cabins for the final night, Mr. Bramley made an announcement that confirmed our suspicions about the seriousness of the situation. "We're going to have counselors conducting regular security patrols throughout the night," he said, trying to make this sound like a routine precaution. "If anyone hears or sees anything unusual, please alert the nearest staff member immediately. And remember, stay in your cabins after lights out, no matter what you might hear outside." The emphasis he placed on those last words, combined with the concerned expressions of the other adults, made it clear that we were facing potential dangers that went far beyond typical camping inconveniences. Back in Cabin 7, our preparations for the night were much more thorough than they had been previously. In addition to our improvised window coverings and door barricade, we arranged our beds to create a defensive position in the center of the cabin and established a rotation system so that someone would be awake and alert throughout the night. We also discussed contingency plans for various scenarios. What to do if someone tried to enter the cabin, how to signal for help, and where to go if we needed to evacuate quickly. These preparations felt simultaneously necessary and absurd, like planning for home invasion while attending summer camp. As darkness fell, the forest around our camp became more active than it had been on either of the previous nights. The communication sounds were louder and more frequent, suggesting a larger number of participants spread across a wider area. There were also new sounds, what appeared to be the movement of heavy objects through the forest, and occasionally what sounded like construction or preparation activities. "They're getting ready for something," Connor whispered during his watch shift around midnight. The systematic testing of our security measures began earlier than usual, but this time it was accompanied by more aggressive behavior. Instead of gentle probing, there were deliberate attempts to remove our window coverings and more forceful testing of our door barricade. Most disturbing was the discovery that our visitors were now communicating directly outside our cabin, conducting whispered conversations in voices that were just loud enough for us to know they were talking, but too quiet for us to understand the words. Then, around 2 a.m., everything stopped. The sudden silence was more frightening than the previous activity had been. It suggested that whatever had been planned was now ready to be implemented and that the investigation phase had ended. For nearly an hour, we heard nothing from outside our cabin except normal forest sounds. Then, gradually, we became aware of a new presence, something large moving through the camp area with purpose and confidence, rather than the stealth that had characterized earlier visits. Heavy footsteps moved directly down the gravel path, past our cabin and toward the main camp buildings. There were sounds of doors being tested and windows being examined, but these investigations were being conducted openly rather than secretively. "Someone's checking all the buildings," David whispered from his position near our covered window. The methodical search continued for what felt like hours, moving from building to building throughout the camp. Occasionally, we could hear what sounded like items being moved or rearranged, though we had no way of knowing what was being disturbed or why. Then, just as dawn was beginning to lighten the sky enough to see shapes outside our windows, there was a sound that made us all freeze in terror. Someone was knocking on our door. Not the tentative tapping of a counselor checking on students, but the firm, deliberate knocking of someone who expected to be admitted. The sound was repeated 3 times, with long pauses between each series of knocks, as though our mysterious visitor was patiently waiting for a response. None of us moved or spoke. The knocking was repeated several more times over the course of about 10 minutes, then stopped completely. When full daylight finally arrived, and we could hear normal camp activities beginning, we cautiously removed our window coverings and door barricade to discover that our final night had brought the most extensive arrangement of forest materials yet. Elaborate construction surrounded not just our cabin but appeared to encompass the entire camp, creating what looked like a complex pattern or message that was too large for us to see in its entirety from ground level. But most unsettling was what we found directly in front of our door, a carefully arranged collection of objects that included several items that definitely hadn't come from the forest. Among the usual sticks, stones, and bones were pieces of metal, glass, and fabric that appeared to have been taken from the camp itself. The morning of our departure brought a flurry of activity as counselors and maintenance staff worked to dismantle the elaborate arrangements that had appeared throughout the camp during the night. What we had been able to see from our cabin's limited perspective turned out to be just a small portion of a construction that covered the entire facility. Viewed from the elevated position of the mess hall deck, the pattern became more apparent. Lines of arranged materials connected all the major buildings, creating geometric shapes and pathways that seemed to serve some organizational purpose. The complexity and scale of the construction suggested both significant planning and intimate knowledge of the camp's layout. Mr. Bramley's attempts to explain these developments as natural accumulation of forest debris due to unusual wind patterns were so transparently false that even he seemed embarrassed to be offering them. The precision and deliberate nature of the arrangements were obvious to anyone who looked at them, and several pieces of camp property had clearly been incorporated into the constructions. Mrs. Kowalski, who had apparently reached the end of her patience with the camp's explanations, demanded a private meeting with the senior staff. While we couldn't hear the details of their conversation, the animated gestures and raised voices visible through the office windows suggested that she was expressing serious concerns about our safety and the camp's management of the situation. As we packed our belongings and prepared for the bus trip home, several of my classmates discovered that small items from their cabins had gone missing during the night. Nothing valuable or essential had been taken, but personal objects, combs, pens, small articles of clothing, had disappeared and been replaced with forest materials arranged in the same patterns we had seen outside. "It's like they were trading with us," Kevin observed as he showed us a small construction of twigs and stones that had been left on his pillow in place of his missing comb. The idea that our mysterious watchers had been entering the cabins while we slept was more terrifying than any of the external activities we had experienced. The realization that we had been completely vulnerable throughout our stay, and that only the unknown intentions of our observers had prevented more serious encounters, left all of us eager to leave as quickly as possible. The bus ride back to Burlington was subdued, with most students sleeping or staring quietly out the windows at the passing landscape. The normal excitement and storytelling that followed school trips was completely absent, replaced by a shared understanding that we had experienced something that defied easy explanation or casual discussion. Mrs. Kowalski spent most of the journey on her phone, apparently making reports to school administration and possibly other authorities about the events at Camp Kitchikinichek. Her side of these conversations included phrases like completely unacceptable safety protocols and immediate investigation required that suggested serious consequences for the camp's future operations. As the weeks passed after our return home, I found myself unable to discuss the camping trip in any detail with friends or family. The events we had experienced seemed too strange and unsettling to share casually, and I worried that describing them accurately would make me sound delusional or attention-seeking. But the experience had fundamentally changed my relationship with wilderness environments. Where I had previously simply felt out of place in natural settings, I now felt actively threatened by any situation where I couldn't see clearly in all directions or where unknown individuals might be present without my knowledge. It wasn't until the following spring, when my younger sister Diana was preparing for her own 8th grade camping trip, that I learned our experiences hadn't been unique to our particular group. Diana's class was scheduled to visit the same camp, and when I warned her about potential problems, she told me that Camp Kitchikinachek had been the subject of considerable discussion among the teachers at our school. Apparently, multiple school groups had reported similar experiences over the years, and there was growing concern about the camp's suitability for educational trips. Mrs. Rodriguez said they're not sending any more classes there, Diana told me. Something about ongoing security issues and problems with the local management. Despite these concerns, Diana's trip proceeded as scheduled, though with additional adult supervision and modified activities that kept the group closer to the main facilities. Her experience turned out to be quite different from ours, less dramatic, but still unsettling enough to confirm that something unusual was happening in that particular area of Algonquin Park. We didn't see anyone directly, she reported after returning home, but there were definitely people moving around in the forest at night. And on our second day, when we were hiking near the lake, I saw someone sitting on a log watching us from across the water. Her description of the figure, small, dressed in what appeared to be assembled natural materials, and completely motionless despite being clearly visible, matched what several of her classmates had also observed. Unlike our group's brief glimpses and peripheral sightings, Diana's class had apparently been allowed more direct observation, though from a safer distance. The counselors acted like it was totally normal, Diana continued. They said it was probably just a park worker or researcher, but park workers don't usually wear animal skins and sit completely still for hours at a time. Over the following years, I occasionally researched what information was available about the area around Camp Kitchikinachek. News reports and Park Service documents mentioned ongoing issues with unauthorized camping and problems with individuals living illegally in protected wilderness areas, but provided no details about the nature or extent of these issues. What I did find were scattered references to similar situations in other remote wilderness areas, cases where legitimate outdoor education programs had been disrupted by encounters with people who appeared to be living completely outside normal society. These individuals were consistently described as reclusive, highly adapted to wilderness survival, and generally avoiding direct contact with outsiders while still monitoring their activities closely. Most disturbing were reports suggesting that these weren't isolated hermits or individual survivalists, but organized groups that had established territorial claims in remote areas and were actively working to discourage outside intrusion into their domains. The sophisticated coordination we had observed at Camp Kitchikinachek appeared to be typical of these groups rather than exceptional. Now, more than a decade later, I still occasionally have nightmares about those 3 nights in Algonquin Park. In my dreams, I'm always back in Cabin 7, lying in that narrow bed beside the door that wouldn't close properly, listening to footsteps moving around our shelter, while knowing that thin mesh windows and improvised barricades provided no real protection against whatever was examining us in the darkness. But the most unsettling aspect of those dreams isn't the fear or helplessness I felt during the actual experience. It's the growing certainty that those mysterious watchers weren't simply observing us out of curiosity or territorial concern. The systematic nature of their investigation, the careful collection of our personal items, and the elaborate messages they left behind suggested that they were gathering information about us for purposes that we couldn't understand, but that were clearly more complex than simple wilderness survival. Even now, when I see news reports about missing hikers or unexplained incidents in remote wilderness areas, I wonder how many of those cases might involve encounters with groups like the ones we encountered at Algonquin Park. And I'm grateful that our particular encounter ended with nothing more than a few sleepless nights and a lasting aversion to camping, rather than becoming one of those unexplained disappearances that occasionally make national news. The woods around Camp Kitchikinachek are still there, still hosting school groups and summer camps, though apparently with much more restrictive policies about nighttime activities and wilderness exploration. But I suspect that the real inhabitants of that forest are still there too, still watching, still collecting information about the temporary visitors who intrude briefly into their carefully maintained territory. And sometimes, when the wind is particularly strong at night and tree branches scrape against my bedroom window here in Burlington, I'm reminded that the distance between civilization and true wilderness might be much smaller than most of us prefer to believe. Rachel, my fiancée, and I were on hour 17 into our drive to her family's cabin in northern Minnesota for a small vacation. I glanced at her with heavy eyelids to see that she was fast asleep in the passenger seat. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent through desolate back roads in towns that consisted of 100 people and a lone stoplight. I could feel myself immersing into the solitude as the roads began to be labeled by numbers instead of names. Finally, I turned onto the long stretch of road that winded through the forest and led to our destination, the cabin. Siri let me know there was 2 miles left. Then everything went back to silence. The car slowly trudged over the underdeveloped road as large chunks of gravel crunched and tumbled beneath the wheels while towering pine trees loomed above us, blocking out any stars. We arrived and I was so exhausted that I considered just sleeping right there in the driveway. I'd never been to this cabin before, but upon first glance it was quite cozy. It's not one of those decked-out cabins that ridged people by, but it had 3 bedrooms and set just offshore to a small 100-acre lake. We quickly unloaded everything and collapsed onto a bed that smelled older than time. Though we were completely beat, we were excited to spend some time away from it all. The sun lit up our room early the next morning, and I was filled with a huge sense of relief when, out of routine, I checked my phone to see that there was no service. Nobody could bother us even if they tried. Rachel offered to drive to the nearest town to get some groceries so I could settle in and check out the cabin myself. I rifled through hundreds of dusty books that sat on the shelves in the living room. Then I pulled out a dozen board games as I excitedly planned out our time ahead. I made my way outside and onto the dock that stretched out into the lake. A small boat lightly rocked in the water, and the dock creaked and groaned underneath my feet. I stared out at the lake and finally felt the last of my anxiety dissipate. As the drive to town was around half an hour, I figured I would set out on the lake to do some fishing. A small island caught my eye that sat close to the middle of the water. It was maybe 100 yards in diameter and was filled with dense trees and shrubs. Something about it drew me toward it. I can't really describe it, but it's like it slowly sucked me in. The island had an almost eerie glow about it, like it wasn't really in the same world as ours. I anchored maybe 50 feet from the shore and started casting. It wasn't 30 seconds after that, I felt something hit my boat. I had nearly had whatever was on the line up to the boat. It must have gotten off the hook, I thought. Hit the boat before swimming away. When I reached down to reapply the bait, I saw a fish dangling off the end of the line still. An uneasy feeling washed over me when I saw that it was completely mangled. It was nearly ripped in half with tears all along what was left of its body. My first thought was that a bigger fish must have jumped on it, but I didn't feel any sort of struggle that would indicate such. Maybe an otter, I thought. But again, I didn't feel a struggle when I reeled it in. I tried to ignore this and moved on to the opposite side of the island, resuming my fishing. But again, the next thing I hooked suddenly stopped fighting. I pulled up another shredded fish carcass. This happened a few more times as I was just curious at this point as to what was happening. I looked toward the island and felt such dread, like the island itself had eyes and was staring me down. I slowly rowed myself away to another spot closer to the cabin and started to catch some actually intact fish, all the while taking brief glances at that island. After hauling in decent-sized bass, I heard Rachel pull into the driveway. So I decided to make my way back and try to forget about this experience. Over dinner, I casually brought up the island to Rachel. So I saw there was this island in the middle of the lake. Have you ever been to it? I asked. Oh, that? Nah, my dad always just told us to not go over there. He said the land is still owned by the family of some woman who used to live there. She responded. Wait, someone used to live there? How? I asked. Yeah. He said that there was a woman who had a house there. She owned some knick-knack shop in town until around 50 years ago when she died. She'd have to row to the dock every morning just to get to her car, she explained. Must have been a pain in the butt to get groceries there, I said with a laugh. Yeah, my dad said she was super creepy, and they would sometimes catch her staring at them from the shore while they fished. She elaborated. Well, that's just weird, I said, kind of laughing it off. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure none of it was real. I think he just told us those things to keep us from going to the lake and messing around, she said with the laugh of her own. The rest of the day was spent playing various board games, reading, and just lounging around the cabin. However, each time I passed the living room window, I felt that distinct feeling of being watched. Each time I would glance out to see that island looming in the distance, curiosity was starting to nag at me, especially now that I was told that there was a house sitting by itself, probably untouched there for decades. A few days passed by, and we spent our time doing more of the same. While relaxing like this was exactly what I needed. I couldn't get my mind off of that island. I had barely done any fishing since I did my first trip on the lake, as I always felt like something just didn't want me there. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that once Rachel fell asleep, I was going to row out there to check it myself. It probably was just some urban legend her dad had concocted to scare the kids. But part of me wanted to know if it was real. Wanted it to be real. I sat up in bed reading, waiting for Rachel to fall asleep. She fell asleep faster than anybody I'd ever met and could sleep through a hurricane. So I knew I wouldn't have to wait too long. She really wasn't a fan of anything creepy, and going to an abandoned house in the middle of the night was not something she'd be interested in. But I did feel kind of bad doing this without telling her. Then again, I knew she would just protest if she knew. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, a hunting knife just in case, and my phone to record anything noteworthy. Rachel was asleep within minutes of laying her head down, and after waiting maybe 20 just to be safe, I turned out the lights and quietly made my way out of the cabin. It was dead quiet outside as I made my way down to the dock. No frogs, no crickets, nothing making a sound that night. I pushed off the dock and rowed my way toward the island. Each dip of the oars into the water seemed so loud in the complete silence of the night. I was so anxious to see if Rachel's dad's stories were true or just legend. Either way, there was something off about this island, and I desperately wanted to see it for myself. I pulled up to it and circled around for a minute. The moon was bright enough for me to see the shoreline as I scanned for any spots that were clear enough for me to set anchor. Finally, I spotted a stump jutting out from the land that was partially submerged. The boat drifted towards it as I grabbed a hold and hoisted myself onto the land. I tied the rope to the stump, and after making sure it was secure, I clumsily stepped through the thick brush until I made my way onto what appeared to be someone's yard. I switched on my flashlight to see a disheveled home sitting in the very middle of the island. It stood 2 stories with rotting walls and a caved-in roof. No way, I thought to myself, there really is a house here. All of the windows were broken, and the entirety of the house was suffocated by an overgrowth of ancient vines. The trees were so dense around it that it blacked out the sky above as this house stood forgotten by time. I remembered to pull out my phone right then to capture anything I might find. I swept the beam of light over the house after I hit record, then I made my way over. My feet crunched on fallen, dead branches and leaves. That sense of dread returned to me with a vengeance. I'd come this far, and I was not going to turn back now. I shined the light on the front door that sat ajar. I shone the light through the openings where the windows used to be. It was eerie, to say the least. Whoever lived here really must have owned a knick-knack shop or something, because dozens of miscellaneous items were strewn across the floor, coated in years of thick dust. A box spring mattress looked as if it had been thrown across the room as it sat partially upright against a decaying wall. I put my weight into the door, and it agonizingly creaked open, letting out decades of neglect. The air was dense and unforgiving as I swept my phone all around to record all these long-forgotten memories. Dozens of various trinkets, household tools, and ceramic animals covered the floors as I carefully stepped over the abandoned piles. I shifted the light to one corner of the room and felt my heart jump where I saw a pile of maybe a dozen baby dolls lying in a heap. I made my way towards them as the floor creaked and groaned. Was seriously starting to get the creeps as I noticed it was significantly colder in the house than it was outside in the summer night. Some of the dolls were missing their heads while others had dirty and torn clothing on them. Right above the pile, I noticed a picture hanging on the wall. I blew off the thick coat of dust and went into a coughing fit as it blew directly back into my eyes and down my throat. When I came to, I saw it was one of those creepy old-timey photos of the family where no one was smiling, just vacant expressions staring back at me. There was a 30-something-year-old woman holding a baby with two little boys sitting by her sides. I realized they were standing in front of the house that I was currently invading. I turned around, and my blood ran cold. Standing at the opposite edge of the room in a doorway was a small boy, lit up in the beam of my flashlight. I jumped out of my skin and screamed as the light illuminated this figure. He was maybe 7 or 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and deep brown eyes. The light in his face didn't seem to bother him as he stared straight through me. I quickly recognized his face as one of the boys in the photograph. "Sir, what are you doing here?" The words slithered out of his mouth and up my spine, sending a cold chill throughout my body. I sat there dumbfounded as I stammered at the ghostly figure. "Can you help my brother?" "Please, sir," the boy requested of me. I was speechless. He quickly turned and darted into the room behind him. I stood there for a moment, but then I realized I had all of this on video and I was seeing dollar signs. This was the most incredible and terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. I took a deep breath, made sure the phone was still recording, and made my way into the room. I passed through the doorway and into a room that looked pristine. Clean floors, painted walls, and wooden rocking chairs. It even appeared that night had turned back into day as the room looked dimly lit in the early morning light. I spotted yet another child off in the corner, just sitting on the floor, looking away from me, while the one who urged me into the room was leaning over something wrapped up on a couch. I made my way over to him, then glanced over his shoulder to see a baby cuddled up in a blanket cocoon. "He feels cold, sir. He hasn't made a sound in a long time, and we don't know what's wrong," the little boy said to me with sadness in his voice. The other child began rocking nervously, hands clenched around his legs as he formed into a little ball. "Can you help us, sir?" the boy pleaded. The rocking child began to whimper and mumble under his breath. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I can do to help." I spoke to him. "Is your mother around? She can help you." It was at that moment that I heard a sound coming up from a staircase that I hadn't seen before. It started out very faint, but as the sound gradually grew, I could make out the heartbreaking sound of a woman crying. It persisted until it was a full-fledged wail that was ringing throughout the house. The boy rocking in the other corner quickly rose and sprinted out of the room. "You should leave, mister. She doesn't like visitors." At that moment, it was like something flipped a switch, and the once immaculate room was now dark and cluttered with disgusting furniture that was torn and rotting. The wailing from upstairs hadn't ceased, and I heard loud, vicious stomping on the floor right above me, rapidly, making its way to the staircase and starting the descent to the room I was in. I felt frozen in place. I shined the light down onto the couch to see a dirty, dust-caked doll lying there in a blanket. I looked back up at what sounded like a raging bull hit the bottom of the stairs, then just stopped. So did the crying. I fell back and waited for what felt like hours for something to show itself. I tried to crawl backwards as my legs seemed to stop working. After what felt like an eternity, it started its way towards me, and my heart sank. Thud, thud, thud. Each pause between the steps was more suspenseful than the last. I sat there, hands shaking as my flashlight trembled with them. I tried to force myself to turn it off, but it was too late. I watched in horror as a figure dark as night with long, wispy hair and gangly limbs lumbered into the room. It seemed to stop and face me for a moment, and I could feel tears running down my face. After a brief pause, it made its way to the couch. It looked down at the old doll and stroked its head with long, bony fingers. It let its face collapse into its hands, and it began sobbing once more. Same as before, it gradually grew louder and louder until it was nearly deafening. It picked up the doll and held it tight to its chest before letting out an ear-piercing scream of pure despair. I was somehow able to get enough of the grip and pull out my knife, but as I did, this thing's neck violently twisted towards me and postured up. It towered high above me as its head nearly grazed the ceiling. At last, my legs found the strength I needed, and adrenaline kicked in. I stopped the video and pocketed my phone before making a mad dash for the door. I heard rapid, heavy stomps close the distance instantly, and I felt a tremendous force knock me through the doorway that I'd been running through. I frantically looked up as my flashlight had fallen from my hands, but I could still make out the figure hurling itself through the beam of light, which was coming from the flashlight wherever it had landed. A symphony of screaming and crying was coming from this thing. It stood over me as it pinned me to the ground with immense strength. I managed to shake my arm free. I then attempted to slash at its base with the knife, but it grabbed my wrist with such force that I felt it was going to snap my arm. It clenched its cold hands around mine and slowly guided the knife down towards my stomach. I tried punching it with my now free hand as it slowly lifted my shirt and began running the blade down my abdomen. I screamed out in pain as it pierced my skin. I felt warm blood slide down my sides. My free hand frantically grasped for anything to use to defend myself with when I felt it go over a large piece of broken glass without hesitating. I grabbed it and stuck the thing in its eye. It let out a horrible cry and fell off me as I managed to sprint out of the house and into the boat. I could hear it crying that same mournful wail as I pushed the boat off and made it back to the cabin. I pulled in and tied the boat down before sprinting up to the house. But when I opened the door, I heard a horrible sound. The same crying was coming from somewhere inside my cabin. It sounded muffled at first, but grew in volume as I approached our bedroom. I made my way to the door, and as I opened it, the crying stopped. All I saw was Rachel slumbering peacefully the way I'd left her. I checked the closets, checked them to the bed, checked every room in the house, but could find no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I dove under the covers and curled up tightly next to Rachel, my body trembling in terror. I decided right there we were leaving the following day. I couldn't be here anymore. I don't know if it was exhaustion or the result of high adrenaline wearing off, but I somehow found sleep after cowering under the covers for a while. I had a dream, though. It was me walking to the shore of the island. I could see our cabin in the distance, a small candle in the living room providing it enough light to be seen. However, I had no control over my movements. Whatever I was actually seeing through looked down at the water, dove in, and began swimming furiously toward the cabin. All the way I screamed for it to stop, but it only gained speed. It climbed onto the dock and sprinted at an unnatural speed, the earth seeming to shake underneath its feet. It opened the door of the cabin, slowing its pace, carefully making its way through the living room, then down the hall. It stopped and looked right at the bedroom door. It creaked open the door and walked inside. There I was, sleeping like a baby. I watched its disgusting, monstrous fingers slowly reach down towards me before violently grabbing me by the throat. I jolted awake and immediately shook Rachel up. "We have to go now." "What?" she replied in a groggy tone. "Just start packing. We're leaving right now." I rushed her into the car and hastily threw everything I could find before speeding down the unpaved road and away from the place. Rachel groggily asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't seem to answer. I felt as though I was in shock and I couldn't get any words to come out. It was then that I remembered the video. I recorded it all. I pulled out my phone and handed it to Rachel. "Go through the videos." "But watch the most recent one," I told her. "I don't understand what I'm looking at here," she said in an exhausted voice before handing me the phone after watching for a few minutes. "What?" "Please, babe, just watch it through," I pleaded with her. She mumbled something but was already asleep again. I didn't really care that she wouldn't see it now. I was just happy to be getting away from that place and back home. I stopped at a rest stop a few hours into the trip. The sun had just finished rising. After making a trip to the bathroom and grabbing a few sodas from a vending machine, I decided to take a look at the video myself. Either Rachel was just half asleep or the video didn't come out clear like I'd hoped. I pulled open the video and my heart sank. There was no house in front of me, just dense brush and a huge pile of bricks and wood. The remains of I scrolled through 2 hours of footage of me just standing there, staring straight ahead at nothing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I scrolled through the video and it was over 3 hours straight of me just standing there. I went to the end of the video before some movement finally caught my eye, because the end of the video consisted of me slowly pulling up my shirt, dragging a knife across my stomach and grunting in pain. Before I dropped the knife and sprinted back to the boat in a panic, making my way back to the cabin. For several hours of the drive, I just sat in silence, unable to comprehend what all had happened. Even when Rachel took over driving, I would not let myself fall asleep in fear of having another nightmare. I didn't want to tell her, and I hoped that she was too tired to even remember me showing it to her. After the long 17-hour drive was finally over, we started to unload our stuff from the car. Rachel was gathering up all of her things, while I started to haul in the larger pieces of luggage into the home. I walked into the house and set down all the luggage I was carrying. I felt a sense of unease take over. The air was thick and heavy and the house was freezing cold. I reached for our doorknob to the bedroom and felt my heart sink. Just beyond the door, I could hear the faint sound of a woman sobbing.